Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. I'm your host, Camille. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know you could be doing a lot of other things, listening to a lot of other things, watching a lot of other things, but I'm really glad that you are taking the time to sit here and chill with me for a little bit. I hope that you're having a good week, that you are staying cool wherever you are. I know there's a lot of heat spikes happening all over the place, so I hope that you're staying cool and that you are not stressing yourself out too much this week. We know we're gonna have some stress, but let's try to keep it reasonable if we can. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about rejection. And rejection is one of the universal experiences that exist. Every single person has experienced some sort of rejection, because essentially rejection is when you don't get the thing that you want, when your plan does not come to fruition, when it doesn't play out the way that you wanted it to, the way that you hoped it would, the way that you thought it would play out. So we're going to talk about some of that today, because I think that rejection and a fear of rejection actually is at the root of a lot of our dysfunction. So if we can understand it better, then maybe we can get to a healthier and more healed place. I also want to talk about it though, because I think that if we can find a different way to interact with rejection, then it would be easier for us to allow God to lead. Sometimes when we face rejection, it makes us question God. And sometimes we feel very betrayed by him when the thing that we thought was going to happen does not happen. So I also want to help us kind of shift and expand our perspective on rejection so that we can really just rest in the comfort of knowing that God has already worked it out for us. I like to say that there are three big fears. There are three general fears that's at the root of a lot of our issues, especially a lot of our internal issues, our mental and emotional challenges. There are three big fears. First being fear of rejection, the second, fear of abandonment, and the third, a fear of failure. And as I was thinking about it, I think that a fear of abandonment and a fear of failure could also go under the umbrella of rejection. When we are abandoned by other people, it speaks to that rejection because it tells us that we were not good enough for them to stay around. They left because of us. We really carry a lot of blame and guilt sometimes when other people leave us. And the way that we carry that is by internalizing this idea that if we could have been better in one way or another, that they wouldn't have left. So at the root of that is also this fear of rejection or this internalized rejection. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. And then we've got the fear of failure. Now, we also carry a lot of responsibility when things don't go right, when things don't go well, when we don't get it right the first time. And we internalize that failure so much, and we take it to mean that if we were only smarter, or if we were faster, or if we had more money, then this thing would have worked out better. So in those senses, it's kind of like a rejection of self there. But rejection is the through line in all of these fears. And I think that's because it does not feel good at all. Let's say that now. It does not feel good at all. And so I never want to minimize anyone's experience, but especially when it comes to being rejected, rejection is a very personal thing. And I think that it's really normal for us to internalize some of that. But just because it's normal doesn't mean that it's healthy or that we should continue to operate that way. Part of why rejection can be so damaging is because it contributes to these beliefs that we have about ourselves. In a previous episode, I talked about core beliefs. And the core belief of rejection has to do with this issue of worthiness. When something does not go the way that we wanted it to go, or when someone doesn't want the same kind of relationship with us that we want, or when this job doesn't hire us, that develops or speaks to this belief that we're not good enough. And that is an issue of worthiness. So the thing doesn't go the way you want it to go. You feel like it's your fault that the thing didn't go the way you wanted it to go. If only you could be a different kind of person, then it would have gone that way. And because you weren't able to be successful in this way, then maybe on some level you start to believe that you're not worthy of this thing. If you were worthy, if you were good enough, then it would have went differently. So now we're talking about worthlessness. And when we have feelings like worthlessness and hopelessness and helplessness, then we're just a hop, skip, and a jump away from depression, anxiety, a lot of these other mental health issues that make it really hard just to live your life. But that belief tells us that there's something wrong with us. There are two categories, I guess, of rejection, and they have a similar effect, but you can be directly rejected or indirectly rejected. And I think that they probably hurt the same, maybe. Direct rejection is someone simply saying, no, thank you. No, thank you to your job application. No, thank you to your relationship proposal. No, thank you to this service that you're wanting to provide. No, thanks. That's if they're being nice. It's a no, thanks. So that's a direct rejection. Then there is the indirect rejection where we have to use our inference and read between the lines. And this is when we're talking about things like ghosting or fading out. Or maybe you have to follow up with the job 2 weeks later and you're wondering if they're still hiring or not because you haven't heard anything. And I think that actually the indirect rejection sometimes can be even more dangerous because that leaves us to come up with our own conclusions as to what might have happened or why we weren't good enough, essentially. So rejection can look a lot of different ways. But if we have this question about our worthiness already, then any type of rejection is only going to exacerbate that question and that belief. And a part of why we put so much weight on the rejection or acceptance of other people is because we've got this fear of being seen. Or maybe the fear of being seen comes from a lot of different rejections, but we have this kind of fear of being perceived, maybe. There's a fear of being perceived by other people because we believe that if we are perceived, then we will be rejected, right? And no one wants to sign up for that, myself included. I've had my fair share of direct and indirect rejections. I don't want to sign up for it again, but I also know that there's not really a way of completely avoiding it. Well, I guess unless you just go into like a tiny shell and you become this hermit and just don't talk to anybody or do anything else with your life ever again. But at that point, like, what kind of life is that? And I might as well risk getting rejected because it's not guaranteed that rejection is going to happen. That's only one possibility. We spend a lot of time thinking about the possibility of things going poorly. We spend a lot of time considering the outcome that's going to be most painful. And we don't really spend any time considering positive outcomes. Or if we do, it's not nearly as much as we spend considering the negative outcomes. And we're just so convinced that the negative thing is going to happen. We have this worst case scenario thinking, and that's the only scenario that we will allow ourselves to entertain is the worst one. But the worst case scenario that we come up with, it really never fully comes to fruition. Like, we never really see the worst thing that we can come up with in our minds because we are so creative and we are so imaginative. And in all of these scenarios, when we think that we're just trying to be prepared, it's actually our imagination. And we're being really creative. All of us are storytellers. All of us could probably go and write a screenplay just based off of our anxiety alone, just based off of our fear of the worst case scenario. We could write an award-winning screenplay or movie or film or TV show. I'm sure that we could because we spend so much time in those worlds, in the world where the worst case scenario exists, in the world where constant rejection exists. Now, again, I don't want to minimize anyone's experience. And I know that some of us have gone through a lot of rejection. And sometimes that rejection has a way of eclipsing the times that we weren't rejected or the times that we were maybe accepted or appreciated. Those times become smaller and smaller and smaller, and the rejection becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it comes to a point where even in hindsight, all we can see is the rejection. All we can see is rejection, and that makes us so fearful of moving forward at all. That makes us so fearful of being perceived or of being seen because all we know is rejection. when we've been rejected by other people, it's easy for us to begin or to learn to reject ourselves, especially if we did not have a very solid sense of identity or who we are. So just like with most trauma, if we experience rejection fairly early, as we're still developing into our own sense of self, as we're still developing our personal identity, if we experience some painful rejections at that time, then that is going to imprint on us. That's going to imprint on our sense of self and our sense of identity and our core beliefs of what we believe about ourselves. So if at a young age, you are believing that you are not worthy and that you're not good enough, you're not as good as other people, and that there's something wrong with you, then as you grow and matriculate, all of your efforts are going to go to trying to make up for the fact that you're not good enough. You're going to try to overcompensate for the fact, or you're going to make sure that people never get close enough to you to actually reject you in meaningful ways. You're going to deny some of the parts of you that are authentic to who you are, and you're going to instead try to emulate the people that you see around you. So we really learn a lot of those patterns of behavior very young when we experience painful rejections at a young age. A lot of people that struggle with depression have a deep-rooted fear of rejection. And the way that that manifests itself is in lack of, interest or motivation in doing things that are going to better your life or your well-being. Hopelessness is one of the pillars of depression. And that is the one that I find the hardest to work with personally. But that is what drives a lot of the reasons that I hear as to why someone can't try something new, or as to why this thing won't work, or there's no use in even trying that because I already know what's going to happen. I already know it's not going to work out. I'm going to be in the same situation, and there's just no hope. When that hopelessness is born of a core belief that you are not good and that there is something wrong with you, it is really difficult to undo some of that conditioning. It's really hard to unlearn and relearn something else, because in order to get there, you have to buy in to the idea that maybe you're not worse than everyone else, that maybe you're not worthless, that maybe you have more value than you're giving yourself credit for. Even if everyone else doesn't see it, maybe there is more value than you're giving yourself credit for. That's not an overnight kind of thing. When these beliefs have been with us for so long, it's all we know. It's all we know, and it's safer a lot of the times to hold on to these beliefs because they're familiar. There is so much comfort in familiarity. When we talk about our comfort zones and stepping outside of our comfort zone, the reason that's so difficult is because it's familiar to us. We are comfortable with familiarity. Some of us have different personalities that come out around different people, right? The way I am with my family and my close friends is very different from the way that I might be with coworkers or with church members that I'm not as close with. That's going to be different. I'm comfortable with people that I'm more familiar with. The same thing goes for mindset. We are comfortable in mindsets that are familiar to us, even if they are harmful or dangerous or dysfunctional. They're familiar, therefore they are comfortable. This is also where we see a lot of self-sabotage. We're unwilling to consider something else. We're unwilling to try on a different mindset because we don't know what it will bring. The fear of the unknown, actually, that's probably the biggest fear. The fear of the unknown will keep you so stagnant. The fear of the unknown will keep you blindly attached and loyal to mindsets and patterns that are so destructive, just because we don't know what it might be like to put them down. What might it be like to not always have to carry around this feeling of worthlessness? What might it be like if you didn't always have to carry the guilt and shame that has been with you for so long? What might it be like just to put it down for a minute? Like, you can pick it up again later, because it's been with you for so long and you feel like it's your responsibility to carry it. You feel like you have to. I understand that. But what might it be like if you could just put it down for a moment, like a moment of relief from the shame or from the guilt or from the fear? Can you imagine that? just for a second. And it can be hard to imagine that even just for a second because it's been with you for so long. All of your memories include this thing. All of your memories, all of who you believe yourself to be includes this thing. When this thing has contributed so much to your identity and who you are, then putting it down also means now asking the question, who am I without it? Who am I without the shame? Who am I without the guilt? Who am I without this core belief? And that's a really scary question because it's a really big question. It's one of those big existential questions, and it's a really big one. And we don't want to think about it. It's easier just to stick with what you know. So we find ourselves in these patterns and in these ruts and in these really destructive thought processes, and all because it's easier and more comfortable to stick with what you know. How did we get on this topic? That wasn't in the outline. But I want to talk about the fear of being perceived. I am hearing that more and more these days, that I just don't even want to be perceived. And not even am I hearing it, but I think I'm also experiencing it myself. I went to the gym the other day. I'm trying to get back into my early morning gym routine. But the reason that I like going early in the morning is because usually it's empty. But I'm at a new gym now. And for some reason, even early in the morning, it is not empty. There are far too many people in there for my liking and for my comfortability, because I don't want to be perceived, especially while I'm exercising, while I'm doing something that I don't feel the most confident in. I'm doing something related to my body, which, as we've stated before, I have a complicated relationship with. So I don't want other people to see me in this space that feels vulnerable for me. So before I even go inside, the headphones have to be on, even if nothing else is playing, because I feel like that just makes me more invisible. I don't know. I feel like my headphones are my invisibility cloak. But I really have had to talk myself into going inside, even though there are way too many cars in the parking lot, even though I might have to work out on a machine right next to somebody, and I might not be able to leave both of the ones next to me open, because of this whole idea of being perceived. Because when we are perceived, then we open ourselves up to judgment. You know what? I guess there's more than 3 fears, because the fear of judgment is another one. But no, I think that also goes to the fear of rejection. We don't want to be judged because we don't want to be rejected. We wouldn't care about being judged if we believed that everyone was only going to have good things to say and think about us. But the reason we don't want to be judged is because we don't want to be rejected, I think. Okay, we're still safe. But a while back, I was just talking to God and thinking to myself about this whole idea of being perceived and not wanting to be seen. And what God really revealed to me was, as a child of God, our whole purpose and our goal every single day is to allow that light, His light, to shine from within. Our goal is for people to have interactions with Christ through us. So if I am focused on allowing God to be seen, then I don't have to think as much about myself being seen. Maybe I'm afraid of myself being seen or perceived, because if I think about just me outside of God and the God in me, I don't know what all that is. I don't know what all that is. The only good that I have comes from God. So what might it look like to shift that perspective and focus on making sure that people can see God when they see me? And maybe we can think about that as hiding behind God instead. I'm not going to tell y'all that just don't be scared anymore of people judging you, because they're going to judge you anyway. They are going to judge you anyway. They are. But if I am really walking in the Spirit and living out the fruits of the Spirit, and living as holy and as righteously as I know how, then if you're rejecting me, then you're rejecting God. That's not to say that everyone needs to be your friend, right? Everyone don't get along with everybody else. But the kind of rejection that feels really personal, the kind of rejection that is of your complete existence, if you're rejecting me in that way, then you're rejecting God, because the things that you should be seeing from me are love and kindness and peace and joy and long suffering and forgiveness. Like those should be the things that you're interacting with when you interact with me. The other things outside of that, yeah, I probably would want to reject some of those pieces too, right? Like the backbiting and the gossip and the pettiness. Like you don't have to accept those things because I probably shouldn't be accepting those things either. But when we think about not wanting to be seen or not wanting to be perceived, can we shift that idea to think about how can we allow God to be seen more, right? Less of me, more of you. That's always the goal. That's the prayer. Less of me and more of you. So that, at least for me, takes away some of the sting and takes away some of that fear of being judged or of being seen. As long as I know that I am actively trying to live out the fruits of the Spirit, as long as I know I'm actively trying to live out what we're commanded to do, which is to love God and love one another. If I can say that that is what I'm doing today and you're rejecting that, then okay, I guess. But I hope that reframe will take some of the pressure off that we feel to live up to everyone else's expectation and to be good enough according to somebody else. When we let other people set the standard and set the status quo for what is good enough, then we will always be chasing it. We'll never arrive. We will never be comfortable or confident or content or secure in who we are as long as other people are telling us what's in and what's not, or what's good and what's not. God is the one who tells us that. We don't want to be seen or perceived because we don't know what other people are going to think of us. That is a question that comes up so much. What are people going to think? What are they going to say? How are they going to feel about what I'm doing? They. It's so much about other people. Last week, we talked about external validation and how it's immodest to do things for the validation of other people. And that need for validation, I think is also here in this whole conversation about rejection. We seek validation instead of being rejected. But we are seeking validation from the wrong places and from the wrong people. We really only ought to be seeking validation from God. Now, I do want to say that as people, as humans, we have this instinctual need for acceptance because we're not supposed to do life alone. We are supposed to do life in the context of relationships. So we need other people in our life. And it is a natural human desire to be accepted by other people. Because how else are we going to be in relationships with other people unless we're willing to make room for one another? So we want to find people who are going to make room for us, just like we want to make room for the right people in our life. But I think the way that we interact with this approval and acceptance has room for some flexibility. I think instead of thinking about who we want approval from, we can think about asking God to approve certain people for us. So instead of seeking their approval for who you are, we're seeking God's approval for who they are. And if they are the right people to fulfill a specific role in our life. Is that making sense? I think so much of this boils down to the responsibility that we carry to gain the approval of other people. And I think that's also why we carry so much blame and shame and guilt when relationships don't go well or when they don't last, because we put all the responsibility on us. I need to be a good enough person or a funny enough or smart enough or quick enough person for this person to want me in their life. But what would it look like if we flipped that? And if instead we submitted all these potential relationships to God and allowed Him to approve or confirm them for us, allow Him to be the one to reject people from our lives for our sake. And that is one of the reframes that I think would really help us to deal with this rejection. You know, we hear a lot of the times that rejection is redirection or it's protection. And I wholeheartedly believe that. Because like we just said, we can take the same thing, and if we look at it differently, it can be seen as a blessing instead of a curse, essentially. If we look at someone no longer wanting to be your friend We could look at that as you must not have been a good enough friend because that's why they don't want to be your friend anymore. Or we could say, God, maybe this is you rejecting this person from my life because we're not aligned in some way that I'm not able to see, or because they were going to lead me into sin or temptation, or because we actually don't bring out the best in each other, or because somewhere down the line they were going to do something even more painful to me. If we look at it that way, if we say that if God removes somebody from our life, it's on purpose and it's for our good, then it's a blessing. And it doesn't have to be something that we internalize as a personal rejection or a personal attack. It does not have to speak to a negative core belief. It could actually speak to a different core belief about God. If one of your core beliefs about God is that he is intentional and that everything that he does in your life is for your good, then everything that happens ought to speak to that core belief. If we allow that belief to be the lens that we navigate life with, then that'll make it a lot easier when people kind of come and go, or when things don't work out the way that we wanted them to go. So instead of seeking approval from other people, what would it look like to seek approval from God about other people? That's just a different way of interacting with the ebbs and flows of relationships. And this is not only speaking about relationships. Of course, like we said earlier, rejection can happen anywhere. Let's take the job situation, for example. I know I've been here. I know I've been here. But there was a job that I really wanted or thought that I could have, and it didn't happen. And maybe it felt like a rejection, but then God revealed that it was because he was keeping me available for some other things or for some other opportunities. That has happened to me a couple of times in the past few years. I've been I've been working for myself for several years now, and there are pros and cons of entrepreneurship. One of the cons is that sometimes it's a little bit unstable and unpredictable, and that does not make me feel good. It makes me fearful and it makes me anxious. So there have been times over the past couple of years that I've said, you know what, I need to go and find a different job because this is too unstable. I am too uncomfortable, and I'm too scared. And in hindsight, I'm able to see that the times that it didn't work out for me were the times that I was approaching it with a spirit of fear. I was not bringing it to God initially and asking him what should be done. I was bringing him my petition, what I wanted, but I was not allowing him to give me the motivation for it. My motivation was not coming from him. And it was rejected because it was not in alignment with his will. God's will is never for me to operate from a place of fear. And so if that's what I was doing, then I'm glad that he rejected it. I'm glad. And that was really a blessing, because had I just powered through and found some job, whatever job I could find, I probably would have been miserable. I probably would have been miserable. And that has really become kind of a tenet of how I try to live my life, is not doing things from a place of fear. If I have a decision to make and I'm not sure, if I should be making it or not, I always think about, what place is this decision coming from? Is this decision coming from a place of the spirit? Is this coming from confirmation, or is this something that's going to help me glorify God more, or bring him closer to him? One of the questions I ask is this decision going to bring me closer to him, or pull me further away? But another question is, am I making this decision from a fearful place, from a spirit of fear? And I really try my best not to do anything from that place anymore. I try my best not to make decisions from a place of fear, a spirit of fear. And so in those times, I have really had to learn to lean on my faith and to lean on God. And I've always been okay. He has always provided, even when I felt unstable. I was actually never unstable because God was always there, right? And he's the firm foundation. On Christ, the solid rock I stand, okay? Because all of the ground is what? Sinking sand, period. So instead of seeking approval from these external sources or people, we need to be bringing these things to God. These are our requests and our submissions, things that we're submitting to God. And allowing Him to approve or confirm for us. And we also need to be praying for discernment as well. I think that discernment is going to help us be able to see things as redirection and protection instead of rejection. When we feel rejected by God, we feel betrayed by Him, we feel neglected, we feel abandoned, and that makes us not want to come to Him as much. That makes us hesitant to come to Him. That puts distance in our relationship with Him. That makes us mistrusting of Him. That makes us doubtful of Him. All of that when we feel rejected by God. But when I feel redirected by God, I'm grateful because I know that He sees something ahead that I don't see. And if He doesn't want me to go there, it's because He's taking me somewhere better. So I'm grateful, and it's easier for me to be still and just allow Him to redirect and allow Him to guide, because I know that the map that He has is way better than the one that I had for myself. But I could take the same situation and either lean into the feeling of rejection or lean into the redirection. And they are two completely different outcomes. Rejection brings the mistrust and the doubt and the anger and the betrayal. And redirection brings gratitude and grace and mercy and obedience and peace and stillness. That is a choice that we can make. We always want to have control of the things that are outside of our control. But one of the things that are in our control is how we choose to interact with our circumstances, how we choose to perceive the things that are happening in our life, what we choose to believe about who God is and who He is to us and His desires, His will for us. So you can choose to believe that this was just a rejection and that God is punishing you and that He doesn't want you to have good things. But if that's what you're believing, then I'm not really sure which God you're talking about, because my God does not operate that way. Something may feel like a rejection because it's not what we wanted. But in those moments where we do feel rejected, I want us to think about how we approached the try in the first place. What was our motivation, our motivating factor? Was God involved in the decision to try to move forward in this way? Was it confirmed by God to try to move forward in this way and then it was rejected? If so, why could that be? What could He be protecting you from? What could He be redirecting you from? I also think that sometimes we confirm ourselves and slap God's name on it. I think that sometimes we look for confirmation and we turn something into confirmation that may not be. I have done this. I've absolutely done this, and we'll turn it into confirmation because we want to be able to move forward, and because that's going to give us the confidence and hopefully that's going to help us to get the thing. But I think that we really need to spend some more time in our petitions to God. And as we're petitioning Him for things, and, maybe we need to do an episode about prayer. I've been studying about prayer lately. But as we're petitioning God for things, I don't think that our prayer only needs to be, God, please give me this thing. Let this happen. Let this happen. Let this happen. If our prayer is focused more on the outcome and the things that we're asking for than it is about God or about ourselves or about asking Him to renew us and to change us and to fill us with His presence, then that to me always feels a little bit surface. We should absolutely be bringing our requests to God, but if that's all we're bringing to God, then that is a shallow relationship. If the only time we're talking to Him is when we're asking Him for things and then He doesn't give us the things that we ask for, and then we use that to say, see, God don't hear me. He's not listening to me because He didn't give me what I asked for. Then I think we need to go back and reassess the ask. Maybe our priorities are a bit skewed, because are we asking Him for wisdom? Are we asking Him for discernment? Are we asking Him for guidance? Or are we just asking Him to give us what we want? That's different. Are we asking Him for confirmation and for validation, or are we just asking Him to give us what we want? The definition of rejection is the dismissing or refusing of an idea or a plan. Now, if we're going to talk about plans, we got to talk about control. When things don't go according to plan, we feel really out of control. We're so attached to our plan because that gives us the illusion of control. So sometimes I really believe that God does not allow things to go according to our plan because he is trying to remind us of who's actually in control. And it's not us, especially if God was not involved in making the plan in the first place. If we come up with a plan on our own and then we bring it to God and say, all right, big guy, make it happen, then who are we actually believing is in control? We're believing that we're in control and that we're telling God what to do. It don't work that way. So was he involved in making the plan? But also, what is your relationship like with control? What is your relationship like with planning, and what's your relationship like with control? Do you hold on to the control because it gives you comfort? Is that a part of your comfort zone that we talked about earlier? And do you need to let go of some of that and increase your faith to allow God to be in control? God is intentional in everything that he does. And sometimes he puts us in positions where we have no other choice, no other option than to rely on him and not on ourselves. But rejection can be so disorienting because it can make us feel out of control. And that can be a scary place to be for a lot of us because some scary things have happened maybe when we weren't in control. Maybe some painful things have happened when we weren't in control. When we're trying to control things and we're trying to plan so much, a lot of the times is to relieve some of our own suffering. But that in itself is a part of the problem. We're trying to relieve our own suffering instead of asking God to join us in our suffering and to comfort us and to show us a way out of it. We don't have control. We don't have the power to do that. So a part of this and this whole conversation about rejection and acceptance is an acceptance of who God is and the role that he is wanting to occupy in your life, which is Lord of your life. He's the one who's in control. He's the one making the plans, and he's the one carrying the plans out. God rejects our plan and our will when it does not align with his. It's not in God's will for you to be in control of every aspect of your life at all. If we look in the Bible, them folks was not in control, okay? It's not in God's will for you to be in control of everything in your life. So he's not going to allow you to be. And anytime we think we have control, that's why we call it an illusion of control, because it's not actually ours. It doesn't belong to us. But God is going to reject the plans that don't align with his will. And sometimes I know it feels unfair when he doesn't text us, letting us know like what the specific will for our life is. But his word tells us what his will is for us as his people. So at the very least, we start there. We start with aligning our life with the will that God has laid out in his word for his people. Because the blessing is that God is always going to redirect you back to his will, or he's going to redirect you and put you back in a position where you can easily follow his will if you choose to. He's always going to position you to be able to be obedient to him. He's never going to make it hard or a trick question. He's not going to build an obstacle course to obedience. He's always going to redirect you back to a position where obedience is an option. But do we see it that way? And are we willing to take that option, even if it's the one that makes us feel like we're not in control? We have to know also that when God rejects our plans, that sometimes he's protecting us. We have no idea of what the enemy has planned for us and for the traps that he is trying to set. But he is always so busy. So busy. And sometimes some of y'all will feel me on this. In hindsight, we can be really grateful that God didn't let something work out because we see how it might have played out for other folks. And we're glad that we didn't have to be a part of it. So that's why we say protection. In Psalms 23, when it talks about the rod and the staff, the rod is used to ward off like wolves from the sheep and to keep danger away, right? And the staff is used as guidance. So God is protecting us with his rod and guiding us with our staff. And that's the blessing. It's not that he's trying to beat us into submission. No, but instead, he's actually being proactive in keeping danger away for us or keeping us away from danger. So it's always a blessing. Whatever God does and does not do in our life is a blessing, even if it doesn't feel like that in the moment. And again, if we're talking about feelings and we're talking about the flesh, our flesh is telling us that God does not have our best interest at heart. Our flesh is telling us that God is rejecting us and that he's left us and that he's punishing us. And that is a lie. That is simply not true. So we have to be able to know in the moment that even though something feels like a rejection, that it is actually a redirection or a protection and an opportunity to realign yourself with the will of God. Maybe in some way we've gotten misaligned and we need to realign ourselves with his will. Maybe it's an opportunity to come back to him and really allow him to order your steps and wait for his confirmation before moving forward. Maybe it's that, but it's always an opportunity to realign with his will. It is always an opportunity to know him more and to be closer to him. It's always an opportunity for intimacy. So it's hard to trust the redirection sometimes because of how it feels. Because how it feels speaks to those core beliefs that we mentioned earlier. But a really important question that we have to ask ourselves is, who wrote that core belief? Who authored that core belief? Is the core belief telling me that I am unworthy? If so, who did that come from? It didn't come from God. The belief about who you are. What does God say about who you are? And is that a part of the core belief that you carry? Our core belief comes sometimes from pain and from trauma and from suffering. And so when we have these wounds and when we are unhealed, then those beliefs are really deep and our identity is so affected by it. But what would it look like, or what would those beliefs look like or sound like or feel like if we were healed instead? If we were healed and if we allowed God to occupy that space in our heart, and if we allow God to occupy that space in our mind, that tells us who we are. I think that would also make it easier for us to detach from specific outcomes. We're very attached to specific outcomes because of what it means to us if that outcome does or does not come to fruition. But when we are secure in who God says we are, and when we allow that identity to author these core beliefs, then we are not as affected by the rejection because we don't internalize it in the same way. And we're not as attached to specific outcomes. And that helps us to be more open to God's guidance in whatever direction. And it helps us to really strengthen our faith in that way. It just helps us to lean into this idea that God has not forgotten about us and that he has a specific plan for you and that we are in the middle of it playing out. We have to trust that because he's not always going to give us the blueprint ahead of time. But if we believe what he says about us, if we believe what he says about what he wants for us, then it is a lot easier to let him lead and to take a rejection as a redirection and be grateful for the protection. Okay, that was a lot. I feel like I'm getting a bit redundant. So let's move on. Let's move on to our scripture of the day and let's see what the word has to say about some of this. Okay, so today's verse, it's coming from Jeremiah and it's coming from the well-known verse in chapter 29, but we're going to be looking at Jeremiah 29, starting at verse 10 through 14. Usually we just read verse 11, but I think that it's really important to read it in context, and we'll talk about why. It says, "For thus says the Lord, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and will gather you from all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place where I sent you into exile." We always start at verse 11, but it's important to start at verse 10 because verse 10 says, after it's been some time, after 70 years, then I will come and get you. After we've been in the suffering. I think we need to hear that because so often we feel forgotten by God because he allows us to remain in seasons and spaces of pain and suffering. We try to make plans to solve that when we feel like God is taking too long. But God's timing is always perfect, even when he allows us to stay in situations that are difficult and that are painful. His timing is still perfect even then. And his word says that even though you're going to be there for 70 years, I still know that I have these good plans for you. We may not be able to conceptualize that. We may not be able to conceptualize that after 2 or 3 years in this really unhealthy and toxic relationship, that somehow God has a plan for me that's good, that God is going to somehow work this out when he's left me here for this long. And we feel like he has left us, and we feel so betrayed and so abandoned because he has left us. But just because he has allowed us to stay in certain situations doesn't mean he's left us there alone. We have to remember that. Because if we don't hold that true, then we will believe that God has abandoned us and that he's punishing us for something, if we really believe that he left us there alone. But if God is not providing the change that you want to see, it's not because he left you alone. I don't know all the reasons, but I do know that sometimes we need endurance. And I know that the Bible speaks over and over again about having endurance and growing in endurance, and that sometimes God leaves us in certain situations so that we can grow in endurance, so that we can learn to endure with him. I'm not going to say that that's always the case, because I don't know everyone's situation, and I don't think it would be fair to say. But sometimes God leaves us somewhere so that we can learn to endure, and so that we can grow in patience, so that we can grow in our faith. If he just removed us from every painful and every difficult situation immediately, then how would our faith grow? How would we grow in endurance? How would we grow in patience? If he just, every single time we were uncomfortable, he was like, all right, boom, I'm moving you somewhere where you're more comfortable. That's not the life that he promised us. But he has promised to never leave us. This verse also says, when you call upon me, I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. Regardless of where we are, God is there too. He is hearing us and he's with us in it. If we are seeking God and we are genuine in our search for him, we are always going to find him. Even in our rejection, if we search for God in our rejection, we're going to find him, and we're going to find the truth of that grace and that mercy of his redirection and of his protection. But if we refuse to see it, if we're not looking for him, but instead we are looking for confirmation of our own will, then we're not going to find him, and we're going to feel alone, and we're going to feel like he has betrayed us. And we're going to lie to ourselves or allow the enemy to lie to us about who God is and what he actually has for us. We feel sometimes like things have to change so that we can do good, right? Like we want to change because we're avoidant of hard things. I've definitely been guilty of this and have been called out for it too. We want things to change because we don't want to do the hard thing. It's too hard and I want to be in an easier situation. God, if you would just give me some more money, then I could give more to your church. Or if you would just give me more time, then I could do more ministry. And we feel like the circumstances have to be perfect for us to obey. Your circumstances do not have to change in order for you to be obedient to God. Your circumstances do not have to change in order for you to live a life that is pleasing to him. God will always make a way for you to be obedient. He will always make a way for you to be in alignment with his will for your life. We just have to see it and believe it. Okay, let's move on to our question for the day, wrapping up here. Just as a reminder, if you have a question that you want answered on the show, please send me an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment wherever you're watching or listening to this. Y'all, they got comments on Spotify now. So go ahead and leave a question in the comments if you have one, or anywhere on social media at Therapy and Prayer. Today's question says, I try not to have expectations, but sometimes I just do. And I'm having trouble dealing and processing things when they don't go according to plan or like things are not what I expected. What can I do in situations like this? Okay, so the key word here is expectations. One of my favorite quotes is, expectation is the root of all disappointment. Very, 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 very true. I want to make a distinction here between expectation and hope or belief. A lot of times, what we call an expectation is actually a hope or a wish. An expectation is something that you expect to happen. You have good reason to believe that this thing is going to come to fruition. Our expectations ought to be rooted in fact and in reality, but often they're rooted in hope and hypothesis. We expect people to show up for us in ways that they have never showed up for us before. So that expectation is not based on the reality of what this person has shown you, but it is based on the hope or the potential of who you think they can be. And so that's why sometimes our expectations lead to disappointment, because just like we talked about earlier with the worst case scenario, we convince ourselves that something is going to happen, even though we have no facts to back up that belief. So that's first things. When we're thinking about our expectations, is it an expectation or is it a hope? Hope is not a bad thing. Hope is not at all a bad thing. But if it's misplaced, then it could lead to disappointment. Hope is a desire, and expectation is a probability. I'm expecting this thing because the probability of it coming to pass because of X, Y, and Z. But we don't always construct our expectations that way. That's one thing. And so restructuring our expectations can make it a lot easier to deal with the disappointment of things not going our way. Now, we've been talking about this today. When things are not going our way or not going according to plan, then what is our relationship like with control? When we are so connected to the outcome or to things going this way, we have a really hard time dealing with the fact that they don't always go that way. When I was expecting this specific outcome because I needed it to validate something within me, or I needed it to meet a need, then it's very fickle and it's very, very fragile. So what is the need that you're trying to meet with this plan? And how can we invite God to help meet that need so that we're not only relying on ourselves? When we only rely on ourselves, then the fall is that much harder. And it's that much more difficult to get back up when we're only relying on ourselves, because every time something doesn't go according to plan, that chips away at our confidence, that chips away at our ability to keep trying and to motivate ourselves. So I would be curious about what that process looks like for you when things don't go your way, that mental and internal process. What is that thought pattern when things don't go your way? What is the belief that then comes behind it? Is the belief that everything is horrible and everything is always horrible, or I should have never even got my hopes up for this thing because of course it's not going to happen, or you were never my friend. If you were my friend, then you wouldn't have acted this way, or like, what is the thought process that comes up? What is the attachment that you have to the outcome and to the plan? And what is your relationship with control? How can you submit and surrender that to God so that you can join Him in making plans for your life instead of making a plan on your own and then bringing it to Him? And then lastly, are you praying for wisdom and guidance and discernment so that you're not only relying on yourself from the very beginning, from the inception of the plan? We need to pray for these things at the inception of the plan, like when we're first writing the plan, all the way through to the end of it, not only after we have constructed a plan in our mind. And then we include God at somewhere along the line. God needs to be included before the plan even comes into place. So we ask for wisdom and discernment and guidance. We ask for God to order our steps and to help us to orchestrate this plan according to His will. And then we know that His will is going to be done. And we ask for His peace, the peace that passes all understanding, so that we can be accepting of whatever the outcome He decides is best. If we are translating a failed plan as a rejection, then it's always going to be hard. So even when plans don't go our way, can you trust that it's going God's way, even if it's not going yours? If so, that ought to make it a little bit easier to kind of sit back and find some comfort in knowing that things are according to plan, even if they're not going according to your plan. Okay? All right. Ooh, that was a lot. Okay. I hope that this was helpful. I think that this really kind of freed some things in me, and I'm hopeful that it had the same effect on some of you. Thank y'all so much for being here. I love you as always, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts. And if the Spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. And make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.